We're in the middle of a service series called The Ingredients of a Christian. And so we've been kind of examining all the different things that would make up a Christian or what the Bible tells us about what a Christian is. And I think it's really easy to find things from Paul. You know, he's kind of writes our how-to book. But I think it's even nicer to go back and read the stories of Jesus, you know, to learn directly from Christ himself. And so we're going to be in the book of John considerably, and so I will have the page numbers up there on the screen for you. They're also in your bulletin. And so our first story is going to be in John chapter 5, and we're going to be floating around in that section that you can navigate with your finger or thumb, and we will start at verse 1. It says, "After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool in Aramaic called Bethesda, which has 5 roofed colonnades. And in these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. And one man was there who had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had already been there a long time, he said to him, 'Do you want to be healed?' The sick man answered him, 'Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred, and while I'm going, another steps down before me.' Jesus said to him, 'Get up, take your bed, and walk.' And at once the man was healed, and he took up his bed and he walked. Now that day was the Sabbath, so the Jews said to the man who had been healed, 'It is the Sabbath, and it is not lawful for you to take up your bed.' But he answered them, 'The man who healed me, that man said to me, Take up your bed and walk.' They asked him, 'Who is the man who said to you, Take up your bed and walk?' Now the man who had been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn, as there was a crowd in that place. Afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, 'See, you are well. Sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you.' So we have a man who's been crippled for 38 years, probably meaning he's older than 38. Could have been injured on the job, and now he just kind of hangs out at the local pool, and in walks Jesus. And Jesus seems to ask this very strange question, doesn't he? Do you want to get well? What kind of question is that? Of course he does. Doesn't he? Well, I don't know. What if he enjoys living on disability? And getting well means that he has to now join the workforce. It means he would have to change the life that he's lived for 38 years. It's not a totally silly question that Jesus asks. You know, sometimes our own weaknesses and our own darknesses, those can be comfortable. You know, those can be familiar. We might not want to let them go. So Jesus' question is like somebody who's shaking somebody else who's asleep. The man says he has no one to help him, and Jesus says, 'I'll help you if you want help.' And Jesus' healing, it's instantaneous, right? Jesus speaks the brokenness of the man's legs away, and the man is able to stand. He has strength. And so for a man who has lived perhaps 38 years in the shadows, 38 years with no one to have him help, Jesus steps in, and he has validation for the man. And Jesus says, 'You know what? Nobody else sees you, but I see you.' This man had lived a life of disability, and on one Sabbath morning, Jesus steps in, and he offers him grace. But that's not where the story ends, is it? Jesus meets up with this same man a little later, and in that same day, he offers this kind of strangely cryptic piece of advice. He says, 'See, you are well. Sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you.' What's that about? Well, it seems to imply maybe the man's condition or his being crippled, it had been the result of a sin that he had committed. So notice Jesus doesn't just heal this man and then leave him. He doesn't just offer him grace and then abandon him. No, Jesus comes with grace and truth. The story comes to us from John, and I tell you, if you read the book of John looking for grace and truth, you're going to find it. If you go all the way back to the beginning and look at John chapter 1, you keep your finger there, you can go all the way back, and you can find something key that John says about Jesus. In John 1, verse 14, it says this, "And the Word," okay, as John's talking about Jesus right now, "became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, Glory as the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. John bore witness about him and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, 'He who comes after me ranks before me because he was before me.' For from his fullness we have received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, the only God who is at the Father's side. He has made him known." John says Jesus is filled with two things. Two things make his makeup. His makeup is grace and truth. And we all know grace and truth, right? Grace says, you're fine. The truth says, you're broken. Grace says, you're forgiven. Truth says, yeah, but you're still a sinner. You're still accountable. So normally, side by side, those things, they're at odds in your spirit. We're talking about the ingredients of a Christian this morning, and I would make a case. We might admit that Christians need to be people of grace and truth, but most of the time they seem to conflict in us, don't they? We try to read the scriptures, and we kind of try to look for a place to land. You know, what side do I pick? And John says Jesus was full of both. So as a disciple, we live with this tension. And I think we want to solve it. We want to resolve it. And I wish Jesus had been one or the other, because that would have been easier to follow. But then I think that, I don't know, it'd almost be too easy. I believe the church is at its best, though, when it offers and embraces both grace and truth and refuses to let go of either one of them. Christians need to stop trying to find a side, stop trying to find a balance, stop trying to resolve the tension, because Jesus never resolved the tension. Jesus said sin was sin, and he said that with truth, and then he paid for it with grace. And see, here's the thing. I think most of us decide where we're going to land depending on what we're talking about. I mean, I like the verses about truth when we're talking about other people, but I like the verses about grace when we're talking about me. Right? This is why you can have Christians that are on both sides of every issue. This is why you can have Christians on both sides of every campaign, both sides of every moral dilemma, because chances are there's a group of Christians who are standing on the side of truth, and there's another group of Christians who are standing on the side of grace. But what we see from Christ and what we see from the story with the man at the pool, John says Jesus is full of both. Well, if you look at another story, John chapter 8. John chapter 8, verse 1, there's another example from the book of John. We'll find something very similar. Verse 1 says, Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. Early in the morning, he came again to the temple, and all the people came to him. And he sat down and taught them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery, and placing her in the midst, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery." So we have a few characters that are in our play. We have a nameless woman who was caught in the act, and we have a crowd of supposed witnesses, okay? And verse 5 says, "Now, in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. What do you say?" So let's clear something up. This isn't a common practice. This isn't something that you just, oh, look, they're doing another stoning. This doesn't happen that often. It's not like, oh, it's 3 o'clock, here it is. People were not drug out into the street and stoned. In fact, I would argue this was probably very rare. Okay, and we're going to see why in just a minute. In verse 6 it says, they said this to test him, that they might have a charge to bring against him. See, in verse 6, that's your proof. You and I missed this because we didn't live back then, but the Pharisees are trying to trap Jesus between a rock and a hard place. If Jesus sticks to the truth of the law, and he says, yes, we stone her, then Jesus is telling them all to break the Roman law, which says that nobody is allowed to publicly execute anyone. Remember, when these same religious leaders, when they want Jesus dead, what do they have to do? They have to go to Rome and ask permission, right? Because the Romans, they're the current police force. They keep order. They're not going to let anyone kill another person in the streets. That's just not going to happen. So this whole scene of the religious leaders and the woman, it's a sight, it's a spectacle. It's strictly to get a reaction from Jesus. But let's just say Jesus opts for grace, and he says, let her go. Well, then the Pharisees will say that Jesus doesn't stand with tradition, that he doesn't stand with the laws of Moses. So which side does Jesus fall on? Which does he pick? Does he pick grace or does he pick truth? Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground, verse 7. And as they continued to ask him, so they're pestering him, say something, he stood up and he said to them, let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her. Okay, so here's the side Jesus is going with. He's going to go with the side of complete truth. Because remember, John says Jesus is full of truth. So Jesus can't do the truth thing a little bit. He can't do it part way. So Jesus says, if we're going to follow the law, then we're going to follow the letter of the law, meaning the person who's innocent in this whole debacle, the non-guilty person, they get to be the first person to throw a stone. Jesus says, find the person who is without sin, and they get to throw the first one. They get to start the whole thing. Verse 8 says, and once more he bent down and wrote on the ground. And when they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the older ones. And Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus stood up and said to her, woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you? She said, no one, Lord. This is awesome. They try to trap Jesus and came up unsuccessful because Jesus did some sort of biblical karate chop on their whole plan. And all the Pharisees, they file out one by one. Their hands are over their mouth. Their tails are between their legs. Jesus is the light of the world, and he exposes their true motives. They weren't going to do it anyway. And more importantly, Jesus finds a way to uphold the truth of the scriptures, doesn't he? Jesus says, neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. And there it is. Jesus is also full of grace. The only one in the group who could have condemned her, because he really was the one that was without sin, right? He pardons her, he forgives her, and then he gives her some instruction. He said, go, and from now on, sin no more. And you can imagine this woman walking away and thinking to herself, he pardoned me, he rescued me, he saved me. He not only saved my life, but he taught me how to live. Jesus is full of grace and truth. So I think the answer for us in searching for, the ingredients of a Christian is to find how Jesus resolves this dilemma of grace and truth. But I think the reality is he doesn't. And I think all too often Christians try to find a side. They don't know where to land on the big issues, and they go with their gut, or they flip a coin, or they go with the side that they kind of already agree with. But if you search the scriptures, I think you're going to find a Savior who is full of grace and full of truth. He is not one side or the other. He is both and. And I think these two stories of John, they're perfect examples for us. Notice how Jesus operates. God heals first, he pardons first, he forgives first, he accepts first, and then he teaches. Then he instructs. Grace comes first, and then comes our obedience. Jesus says, neither do I condemn you. Now go and sin no more. Is that how the Christian church applies grace and truth? Maybe, but I think we typically, sometimes, I think we get it backwards. We say, stop sinning, and then we'll accept you. But see, what we see from Christ is a come-as-you-are mentality, but don't stay that way, right? Jesus tells everyone, come as you are. Romans 15:7 says, therefore welcome one another as Christ has welcomed you for the glory of God. The story of the woman caught is amazing because it's a story of God's grace for a person who's trapped in sin. But did you know there are big Bible bigwigs who do not teach this story in seminary? And they would argue that it's not actually a story from Jesus. Do you know why they would cite these reasons? Because Jesus, they think, is being pictured as somebody who's spineless, as somebody who's wishy-washy. And a lot of people are uncomfortable with the amount of grace that Jesus offers. Jesus shows a lot of grace here. But isn't that what our world needs? Not tearing this story out of the Bible, but living out this story of the Bible. Our world needs grace more than everything else. No more talk about grace, but grace lived out in the lives of Jesus' disciples. One theologian, he says it like this: the world can do almost anything as well or better than the church. You need not be a Christian to build houses, feed the hungry, or heal the sick. There is only one thing the world cannot do. It cannot offer grace. Just listen, the Buddhist Eightfold Path, the Hindu doctrine of karma, the Jewish covenant, and the Muslim code of law, they are all ways to earn God's approval. But the grace of Christ is unique because it alone says God accepts you and loves you unconditionally as you are. Grace is the church's greatest asset, and sometimes it can be the most neglected. How would the average person on the street describe the ingredients of a Christian? I know we've been studying it, but if we were to go and just ask somebody and say, what are some of the ingredients of a Christian? Some would say judgmental, some would say self-righteous, finger pointers. Mark Twain, he said, some people are good in the worst sense of the word. See, in church, we get this feeling of entitlement, as if we worked for something or that we earned something, but that's not the language of the scriptures. That's the language of the law, really. In fact, in Romans 7, Paul says, you are all released from the law. We're released from measuring up. We're released from earning our salvation. Romans 7 says, likewise, my brothers, you have died to the law through the body of Christ so that you may belong to one another. To him who has been raised from the dead in order that we may bear fruit for God. For while we were living in the flesh, our sinful passions aroused by the law were at work in our members to bear fruit for death. But now we are released from the law, having died to that which held us captive, so that we serve in the new way of the Spirit and not in the old way of the written code. Why are we released anyway? Why were we released in the first place? Because we can't measure up. We fall short. None of us can live up to the perfection of the law. The good news is that only by giving up, trying to live a perfect life, and in turn surrendering into the arms of Christ, then we're made better. But sadly, the message that gets heard is fear and judgment and condemnation instead of come as you are. The world hears you're unacceptable as you are. Listen, you didn't make yourself acceptable to God. None of us have made ourselves acceptable to God. And it's not our job to make others acceptable either. What does Jesus teach? Jesus taught God is like a shepherd, right? Who risks the safety of his 99 sheep to go and rescue the one who is lost. God is like a father whose son rejects him and spends all his money, and when his son returns home, that same father runs to meet his son with open arms. God is like a woman who jumps up and down after she sweeps her house because she's found a single coin. Time and time again, Jesus teaches that people matter and that God was not the bad guy in the story. And oftentimes what I find is that when atheists or agnostics tell me about their God or the God that they grew up with, I tell them, I don't believe in your God either. No wonder you don't believe in God. Your God sounds terrible. Listen, if the story doesn't sound like good news, is it God? Because my Bible says the story of God is good news. Saying at our church, come as you are, you create a culture of acceptance. Now, listen carefully. I don't want you to get the wrong idea. Acceptance is not tolerance, okay? Tolerance is putting up with something, especially something you don't like or something you don't agree with. Tolerance does not show that you value somebody else. So don't hear tolerance. Christians are not called to tolerate others. We are called to show grace. Acceptance is also not agreement. Remember, in both stories, Jesus still laid out the hard truth of the matter. Sin was sin, and he didn't agree with it. But the church can be accepting to the sinner without agreeing to the sin. So the question for you this morning would be, acceptance, is that tangibly working out alongside grace? Can you tangibly show people, different than yourself, how much they're worth to God and to the community by accepting them? Scripture reminds us the costly price of acceptance. 1 Peter 3 says, "For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteousness for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God." So the bottom line is, God accepts us. And even when we place other gods ahead of him during the week, ignore him during the week, live our own lives as though we don't need him, he still continues to offer us grace. The church needs to be a place that says, come as you are. But don't stay that way. You see, the reason why acceptance is not tolerance and it's not agreement is because Jesus still expects change. He expects your life to grow. He expects your life to mature. There is an argument that if God always forgives us, then what's the motivation for us to ever get better? If, I can just go on sinning every single day because God's going to forgive me every single day. Paul addresses this in Romans. Paul says, "What shall we say then? Are we to continue in sin so that grace can just abound?" He says, "By no means. How can we who died to sin still live in it?" A few weeks ago, one of the passages of scriptures that we looked at was John 15:5, which says, "I am the vine and you are the branches. Whoever abides in me and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit." And in church, we create also a culture of growth. How do people grow? What does it mean to grow spiritually? Well, I don't think you're going to find 3 special steps or an easy action plan in the Bible, primarily because every single person in a come as you are group, we all come from a different place. And we're all growing at different paces. And each of us requires different things to grow. But the author of Hebrews, they give us some good footing. Hebrews 5 says, "For though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you." Again, the basic principles of the oracles of God. You need milk, not solid food. For everyone who lives on milk is unskilled in the word of righteousness, since he is a child, but solid food is for the mature, for those who have the powers of discernment, trained by constant practice to distinguish good from evil. So what do you see? You need teachers, right? There needs to be a place to learn, and there needs to be discernment. There needs to be training. And growth, that process, it's always messy. It is, for everyone. Growth is full of mistakes. Growth is full of tears. Growth is full of regrets, but it's still an essential part of life. Right now, my son Dermot, he's learning to eat, right? He's learning to eat with utensils. He's so happy, and trust me, growth is a messy process. Maybe only half the food gets in his mouth, if he's lucky. But how else is he going to learn? How does a healthy child grow? With a clear picture of what maturity looks like in their home, right? It's us, we're the example. We, as the parent, we model maturity, don't we? We show them, hey, this is what growing up looks like. Well, with Declan's case, he would look at his mom, not me, but we give them something to shoot for. This is what the outside world needs also. Not condemnation, not people picking up stones, but grace and truth. We need to be forgiven and instructed. We need to hear the question, "Where are your accusers?" and hear the words, "Neither do I condemn you." So many live the Christian life under condemnation. They live under guilt from their past or from their present. So many people don't have that experience of grace, but we need both. We need grace and we need truth. Let the words, neither do I condemn you. Let those ring in your heart, and then learn how to grow and mature differently. Learn to grow, learn to mature. Jesus wants to offer you grace and truth. So here's what I want you to see. When you build a church that says, come as you are, but don't stay that way, when you build a church that has both acceptance and growth, you learn how to do Christianity the way Jesus taught. See, the reason some Christians can pick a side to stand on or pick an issue to support is because an issue, it's just words on a page. But when the Pharisees asked Jesus to pick a side on an issue, what they did was they ignored the person that was right there. And the dilemma of grace versus truth will all fade together, and it will operate perfectly once we learn that Christianity is built on relationships. You can read the Great Commandment, you can read the Great Commission, you can read the New Commandment, or anything else Jesus ever taught or ever did, and the truth is Jesus blended grace and truth in his ministry because Jesus did not stand on a side of an issue. He stood with people, and he touched the lives of people. And the man resting by the side of the pool and the woman caught in adultery, nobody was on their side. Nobody was there to help them. Nobody asked them how they felt. They are nameless, right? They're nameless characters in the Bible. That's why Jesus steps into these stories. When Jesus steps into these stories, they become people. And Jesus acts relationally with grace and truth. People long to feel like they matter. And they long to feel loved, and that only happens in relationships. What can one person do? We always ask that. Well, what can one person do? One person can be a friend. You know, you can make a big difference in somebody else's life just by showing up, being a friend, listening. In his book, Here and Now, Henry Nouwen says ministry is, first of all, receiving God's blessings from those to whom we minister. What is this blessing? It is a glimpse of the face of God. We can see God in the face of Jesus, and we can see the face of Jesus in all those who need our care. Friends, the world is full of those who need our care. In fact, this church is full of those who need our care. What a great place to practice being relational, but right here with the people who already come in through these doors. You know, they always do these studies about how to get more people in through the doors, you know, how to get more people into the church. Forget those people. Build relationships with the people in the church. If you can start building relationships with just the people who come in through the doors, guess what? More people will come in through the doors automatically. If they find out that your church is a place of grace and truth, that your church is a place that says, come as you are, but don't stay that way, where you begin to truly model not just a friendly church, but a church built on friends and friendship, that'll grow. God will bless it, guaranteed. And I believe the church is at its best when it can offer both, when it can offer grace and truth, and it says, you know what, we're not gonna let go of either one of these things. We're not gonna shrink one and raise the other. Christians need to stop trying to find a side, stop trying to find a balance, stop trying to resolve tension, because Jesus didn't resolve tension. Jesus was both, and he was both 100%. And he came as our model. He came as our guide. He came as the mature one for us, right? And because in this situation, we're the children to look up to and to grow and to be like. Jesus was full of grace. Jesus was full of truth. And those are both the ingredients of a Christian. Let's pray.